Greetings, everyone. Before we gather to talk about all things related to complexity and complex adaptive systems, I'm Jocko Stelberg, and I co-host the lounge together with Barbara Frontera and Tiana Jones. Today, we welcome Dr. Michael C. Jackson to the Complexity Lounge. Mike is an established expert in systems thinking and a major figure in the development of critical systems thinking. He is Emeritus Professor and former Dean of the Hull University Business School, okay, and Managing Director of Systems Research Limited. In today's talk, Mike will discuss the history of systems thinking, how systems thinking addresses complexity, and a few examples of systems thinking in action. And then we'll open up the floor for a lively discussion about the intersection of complexity and systems thinking. So, Mike, welcome to the lounge.
Thank you, Jocko, and thank you to you and Barbara and Tiani, who I met previously. It's really nice to have a relaxed space to discuss these ideas, and I think you provide that in the Complexity Lounge, so I'm really grateful for the opportunity. And thanks to everybody interested in attending. I hope you'll find that this is worthwhile over the next hour, 2 hours. I'm going to divide my discussion into two parts. First of all, talking about systems thinking and complexity generally, and I'll do that for, I hope, about 15 minutes. And then maybe we can get into a conversation about those ideas, questions and a conversation. And then I'll, after that finishes, or draws to a close, I'll talk about my own take upon systems thinking, what I call critical systems thinking, which I've been writing about now for, well, 30, 40 years, I guess, and that will lead to hopefully more questions and discussion, and then we can have a general chat at the end, if that suits everybody. So let me start then with 15 minutes generally on systems thinking and complexity. And I guess the point I would make is that systems thinking has always been about navigating complexity. The challenge was set for systems thinking by a guy called Warren Weaver, who was Natural Science Director of the Rockefeller Foundation. And he pointed out in an article that, in his view, science had solved only the simple problems. And something more was necessary to deal with the real problems facing humankind. So his argument was that science was okay with regard to organized simplicity, a few variables, so Newton explained the workings of the solar system, and okay in terms of disorganized complexity, which science could deal with using probability theory and statistics. But when you get organized complexity, then science really struggles. And systems thinking from day one, I'd say, has been seeking to find ways forward in the face of organized complexity. And therefore, I'd want to argue, is a kind of complement to science. In those areas where science cannot help decision makers, then systems thinking has something to offer. Nothing like the clear, careful experimental device that science can offer, but something to offer to aid decision making in situations of organized complexity. I'll just illustrate that in relation to the three founding fathers, really. There's a founding mother, Donella Meadows, but I'll just talk about the work of the three founding fathers of systems thinking. Bogdanov, who predated Weaver and his challenge by some decades. He was about the time of the Russian Revolution. In fact, was at one time as important as Lenin in the Bolshevik Party. He was after a universal science of organization. And the point of that was to put into the hands of, put in the hands of the proletariat, as it was described at that time, the means to build a better society, communist society, as they were seeking to build at that time. And he felt that the proletariat needed a universal science of organization in the transformation from a capitalist to a communist society, because only this universal science of organization, he thought, could deal with the complexity involved. Von Bertalanffy, who people will be more familiar with, I guess, as a founder of systems thinking, he wanted to create a general systems theory, a systems theory relevant to all types of system, whether mechanical, biological, or social. In his view, science couldn't deal with the complexity that was exhibited by biological systems, by open systems, because physics was primarily concerned with closed systems. So in his view, you needed a different sort of organizing concept that would allow you to deal with systems of greater complexity. And he wanted a general system theory that could do that. And the third founding father, I guess, would be Norbert Wiener, the founder of cybernetics, who is interested in communication and control in the animal and the machine. And that soon extended to the social domain as well. And if you read Wiener, then he was interested in how complex systems manage to survive and in a sense overcome the second law of thermodynamics so that they could maintain themselves in existence when the rest of the universe was in a state of entropy or running down. So in the early days of systems, it was all about trying to find general systems laws. But there was always a challenge to that as well. And that was present in von Bertalanffy's work, I'd argue, because he was equally concerned with emergence and new properties that arose at different system levels. So initially, his concern was with biological systems and the new properties that arose there, that he felt you needed a new kind of understanding to deal with, to grasp. But he also talked about human systems, and he also talked about social systems and the new properties that arose when, with greater complexity, you've got the emergence of new phenomena. And that was taken up by Boulding, Kenneth Boulding, and a number of you may know of Boulding's paper, General Systems Theory, Skeleton of Science, when he sets out 9 levels of complexity, moving up from structures through biological systems, through human systems, social systems, up to what he called transcendental systems, 9 levels of complexity, and talked about the laws that the kind of science that was applicable at each level of complexity. And he argued that the laws that were applicable and useful at lower levels of complexity failed to capture the whole picture as you got to higher levels of complexity, particularly at the level of social systems, which was Boulding's concern. Primarily because at that level of complexity, you got the image entering the picture. Humans didn't just act as in a stimulus response way. They had a perception of the world, an image of the world, the way in which they interpreted the world, and they reacted according to that particular image of the world that they had in their heads. So for Boulding, he thought that the models that you could get from lower level systems, in understanding lower level systems, were still useful at high levels, but you had also to take account of emergent properties. And he was interested in appropriate models for appropriate levels. If you just use mechanical models to try and understand social systems, then you'll fall well short. So just let me ask you to keep those ideas in mind. General systems theory, on the one hand, a search for laws of general systems. On the other hand, a search for appropriate systemic approaches at different levels of complexity. So let me just then discourse a little bit upon how system thinkers see complexity before I go on to how they want to address complexity, because clearly the two are there in tandem. So all kinds of definition of complexity goes back to the, if you like, the VUCA definition of the state of the modern world: volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity is a common one. Then you get people like Paul Cilliers, who complexity theorists are very familiar with, I think, his work, and he lays out 10 characteristics of complex systems. A lot of people build on Cilliers' list, and a variety of other lists which are rather similar to Cilliers, which attempt to try and capture the characteristics of complex systems, about the number of variables, interrelationships being variables, their openness, their emergence, their unpredictability, and so on. A really useful other way of thinking about complexity was brought forward by the philosopher Nicholas Rescher, a pragmatist philosopher, and I like this a lot, because in a sense it brings clarity to something that is not absolutely explicit in other definitions, such as that of the characteristics set out by Cilliers. He talks about two forms of complexity, one of which is ontological complexity, and that's the complexity that is there in the world, in his terms. It actually exists in the world. So if you think of the COVID pandemic, the ontological complexity was the sort of nature of the virus itself, how the virus spread, whether it could spread when people didn't have symptoms, the virulence of the virus, and so on. A set of ontological things which could objectively describe the nature of the virus. The other side of it was what Rescher called cognitive complexity, which is not about things that exist in the world, but different perceptions of the nature of reality. And as the COVID pandemic expanded and grew, then obviously cognitive complexity becomes a significant factor in how it develops as well. It's not just the ontological complexity, it's the cognitive complexity. So that's how experts are interpreting the virus through their epidemiological models, how politicians are reacting to that, how they're seeing the relative importance of health and economics, for example, how the population is reacting once they start to distrust the politicians, and so on, how different perceptions of the virus begin to influence the way the pandemic itself develops. So, but Rescher is very clear that the two are, of course, interlinked and interact. So, for example, it became apparent statistically that those in minority groups during the COVID pandemic were suffering most. You could see the statistics that pointed out that Black and minority groups in the UK, and also disabled people in the UK, were suffering most. And that introduced all kinds of speculation as to why that might be the case. Was it genetic? Was it cultural? Was it the domestic circumstances? Was it some kind of institutionalized racism? That got people looking again at it in a different way, examining it again and trying to find objective features of it. And so you got this interaction between ontological and cognitive complexity. So they interrelate, of course, in causing the massive hypercomplexity that leads to issues such as the COVID pandemic. But they're analytically worth keeping separate because different systems approaches tend to prioritize the ontological complexity on the one hand, trying to model that, and the cognitive complexity on the other hand, seeking to work with different perceptions that people have of the situation and seeking to do something with those perceptions, potentially helping them to accommodate one another, reach agreement, and so on. Okay, that's how systems thinkers tend to see complexity. How do they react to it? Again, in two ways, I think, and these ideas come from Edgar Morin, although they have general, you can find them in the systems community in the work of C. West Churchman and Peter Checkland as well. But let's use Edgar Morin's definition, a French systems thinker. Morin said that system thinkers react to complexity in two ways. They either take a restricted complexity stand, whereby they believe that they can somehow model the complexity that exists out there. So they're concentrating pretty much on the ontological complexity. And they can gain some explanation of what's going on through their models. And that's going to enable them to predict and control the situation based upon the model, what the model is telling them about the reality. And that view in Morin's view, that remains within the general perspective of science. It seeks to gain some understanding of some underlying laws which are governing system behavior. And you see this kind of approach in some versions of system dynamics, where you're seeking to look at the interrelationships between the elements, the variables that make up a system, and the feedback and the feed-forward loops and the lags. And you're seeking to bring through stock and flow diagrams an accurate computational model, which you test against reality, and believe that you can capture something about reality that enables you to predict and control what's going on. And I guess with agent-based modeling from the Santa Fe Institute as well, you're seeking to learn something about the underpinning laws governing the behavior of the system so that you can predict and control what's going on. Morin is not particularly in favor of that approach. He doesn't write it off, and it's something we'll come back to in the second part of my talk. He thinks it can be useful in some circumstances to take this kind of restricted complexity view. But he's more in favor of what he calls the kind of more complex thinking, which he calls general complexity. And in general complexity, you accept that you're unable to capture the nature of the system in a way which will enable you to better predict and control it. This falls much more in a pragmatist tradition, whereby the best you can do is bring forward certain partial truths, explore the system of interest using these partial truths, partial methodologies which embed partial truths, and learn your way to what is effective or useful in the situation. So again, in pragmatist terms, you're giving up the idea, and this stems from the early pragmatists, but also from perhaps well known with Richard Rorty, you're giving up the idea of trying to create a mirror of philosophy. It's not a mirror of reality. It's not a mirror of reality. System is not a mirror of reality. Instead, you're trying to find useful ways of engaging with reality, which are going to bring benefits in a particular situation to the human species more generally. So that's a brief outline of how systems thinking came about as an attempt to deal with the kind of complexity that it was felt science was unable for various reasons to manage. All systems thinkers saw themselves seeking to do that, to offer a complementary approach to science at higher levels of complexity. There is nevertheless this division in systems thinking between those who hope to deal with complexity by developing general system laws, such that whatever the system you're examining, you have a set of laws that will help you to better manage it, navigate it, and those who say that's impossible. What we want is to bring systems ideas, appropriate systems ideas, to bear at the right appropriate levels of complexity, while not forgetting the usefulness of models from lower levels. I've then described complexity in terms of the way that there are various characteristics of complex systems, but there's also this useful distinction, I think, made by Rescher between ontological and cognitive complexity, which interrelate, but often people address one rather than the other. And this way of dealing with complexity, which requires you either to produce models which will grasp that complexity and predict and prepare what's occurring so that you can better manage the complexity, or which, in a pragmatist sense, enable you to engage with complexity, a set of partial truths embedded in specific methodologies which you know can't do everything, but which enable improvement to be made in the specific circumstances in which you're operating. Can I leave it at that, Barbara and Jocko, and invite questions and discussion at that stage?
Of course. So let's open the floor. Anybody have any questions based on what's already, or comments based on what's already been said? It was all crystal clear.
That's marvelous.
So maybe just can you hear me?
Yes.
To summarize, I'm new to the subject, but just to summarize, the organized simplicity is easy to study because it's a few number of variables, and you can actually track all of their interactions in a sort of experimental, systematic way. This organized complexity can be studied as a system by defining macro features. So trying to understand where organized complexity sits in the spectrum. And it seems like you can't study it the same way you do disorganized systems or disorganized complexity. But the argument here is that you should be able to do better because you should have an added advantage of understanding its organization, internal organization. But you can't use the same tools and methodologies that you use in simple systems. Is that the idea, the main idea here?
That is certainly one of the ideas I presented. Yes, the number of variables expands. It's you've got the three-body problem, and also the different perspectives on the situation expand. So it's this relationship between ontological and cognitive complexity which is the problem, and of course it gives rise to what Rittel and Weber call wicked problems. And if you interrogate Rittel and Weber's work on wicked problems, you'll find them talking about both those aspects of complexity. So they say that the problems that decision makers face are the interrelated causal loops which nobody can grasp as a whole because there's so many variables and they're so interrelated and they go around in circles, and the relationships are non-linear. And also, in their words, it's the perspectives of the different publics which makes the job of the decision maker difficult, because you have in there different viewpoints about what you want to achieve from the system, what the system, how to see the system, what your objectives are, what you're seeking to achieve, how best to do it, and so on, depending upon the different viewpoints, different intentions, etc. So the thing becomes unmanageable using traditional scientific tools and the traditional scientific method. And I think it also becomes unmanageable using the kind of philosophy that is behind natural science, that the purpose is explanation and prediction and control. So we move towards systems thinking, but a kind of systems thinking in the pragmatic tradition, which is about engaging and learning, using tools and methods and methodologies that have proven useful in circumstances and have got historical credibility. And you learn in each set of circumstances which of those can bring some sort of benefits. What pays, in William James's terms, is pragmatism is about the justification is showing that something pays in the sense that it has payoff for the human species.
So I understand that organized complexity exists and brings about the set of questions and challenges that you presented. But does that, other than understanding that such a phenomena exists, do we have a different set of tools addressing it? And then maybe trying to, sort of articulate various aspects of it. In terms of understanding these systems, do we have a separate set of tools that we can bring about, that we can apply to organized complexity beyond what we already do for disorganized complexity and simple systems? In other words, do we have a different approach other than taking the system as a whole and trying to measure its macro phenomenological properties and/or trying to break off pieces to try to understand them in simpler terms? Do we ultimately find a different set of tools that we bring to the complexity problem?
That was the challenge that I thought Warren Weaver was bringing. That science can do things. It's developed traditional mathematical tools, calculus, etc., to deal with the organized simplicity. It's got a set of tools that it can use to manage disorganized complexity, but it suffers in the realm of organized complexity. And the challenge to systems thinking is to find ways of dealing with organized complexity where science struggles. And therefore, yes, the aim is to have a complementary approach which can be offered to decision makers, because decision makers are often confronted to situations such as the COVID pandemic, where ordinary science struggles. The epidemiological models were producing all kinds of different results about how many people would actually die of COVID, because it all depends upon the input, and there wasn't sufficient knowledge about what things you needed to input into the model and what their quantitative characteristics were. Because of chaos theory, you get it slightly wrong and suddenly a model can produce 2 million dead instead of 50,000 dead. So a different way of approaching that kind of organized complexity.
Got it. Thank you.
Thank you for helping me to make that clear.
So I wonder, does chaos you just described, does it mean the organized complexity cannot be dealt at the system level? It has to be dealt at the lower interactive level, right? Because the system as a whole does not converge.
I think Churchman said that C. West Churchman, who was one of the founders of the kind of soft systems, pragmatist systems tradition in the States, said that in many ways that systems thinking was the messenger that brought the bad news. So if everything is interconnected, which is the lesson you might gain from systems thinking, then you're never going to be able to understand what's happening, because it would take a God's eye view to understand what was happening in the system. And therefore, you're always going to have to act and make decisions in the context of uncertainty. So the question is, having failed inevitably to understand the whole system, how do you best act and take decisions in the light of that uncertainty? And in Churchman's view, and this is carried forward in what I'll describe as critical systems thinking in the second part of the talk, you have to accept that any attempt to understand the system is very partial, and you have to look at where you're falling short in understanding the system. You have to question your assumptions that you're bringing to bear in understanding the system. What values, what facts, what values you're bringing to the table, what facts you're taking into account, and understand that you're understanding it in terms of certain boundaries which you're drawing, which you may not be conscious of, but which you need to become. You need to become conscious of so that you can challenge them. Nobody can understand the whole system. That requires a God's eye view, but we can be reflective about the partiality of our understandings of the whole system. Does that help?
Okay, Kinsey has very patiently had her hand up for quite some time now, and I know she has to pop off for a second. So Kinsey, would you like to give us your question or comment?
Yeah, and I'm actually glad that Mike spoke up and said what he did first. And I'm thinking through this as I speak. So if it's not fleshed out enough to discuss, then tell me. So what came to mind when you were talking about chaos and then organized complexity and organized complexity, it made me think of something that I encountered during my research. And I mentioned before we started that my framework coming into my research was at a systemic level. But I was working on the ground. This is field work in West Africa. And what I found was that there were initiatives, and this speaks to what Mike was saying about, do things need to be addressed at a lower level first? And what I saw was, I was looking partly at popular culture and art, and there were some initiatives that were very much tied to socioeconomic development that developed organically in the community that really took hold. And when that happened, institutions kind of piggybacked on that. And so there became this aspect of organization and formalization. And that was kind of a local complexity. There were lots of different components and colonial histories and everything. And that kind of took away some of the dynamism and responsiveness to it. And I find that I'm going to think about whether that's something that parallels a little bit what might happen with the systems when you try to get too much organization in it, if it constrains them rather than allowing that dynamism to systems, which is partly what defines complex systems. Is that clear what I'm saying? So, and I think that informed the practice, my applied work, which was trying to drive a paradigm shift at that higher level. And it actually worked really well. I mean, in the particular way I was working in that domain. And so I've been thinking about whether that translates in other situations too, but I'm just offering that up.
I think that's good, and it fits with my understanding of the failure of a lot of systems models. Some work of doing with the World Health Organization. They have a body called the Alliance for Health Policy and Systems Research, and they've been questioning the kind of systems approach they use because it's not been gaining traction with decision makers and policy makers. And I think that's because they're using models at too low a level of complexity. For example, they're trying to model something using system dynamics. And it's a big ask to get policymakers, decision makers to engage with a system dynamics model when they've got all their understanding of the political, the cultural issues that surround it, the colonial aspects that surround it. So in a sense, you're engaging at the wrong level. And the paradigm shift would be to engage the policymakers and decision makers where they stand, and to introduce systems models to help with thinking, rather than trying to take over, as it were, as an expert. So again, if I can give you another example from the systems tradition, the paradigm shift in the systems tradition that becomes very important was one made by Peter Checkland. And he said that often systems says, what we're doing is that we're spotting systems out in the world, and then we believe we can engineer them. We can model them and better predict them and control them. And that's only useful in certain circumstances. You know, the world may remain stable enough and everybody may share sufficient agreement about the nature of what's going on and what needs to be achieved for you to use, you know, I don't know, process mapping or systems engineering or one of the hard system dynamics or one of the harder systems approach. Occasionally that will be fine. That engagement with ontological complexity, a restricted complexity approach. But often it'll completely fail. And the paradigm shift is to see there's a world out there of hypercomplexity which people perceive in different ways. And what I can do is use a systemic approach to learn about it, together with those in the situation who have the experience and have the knowledge of context. And I can feed their thinking using systems models, but I can't ever replace it with expertise, because that's going back towards trying to use a model at a lower level of complexity for a reality which is a very high level of complexity, involving all these aspects of cognitive complexity, different perceptions, different intentions, different levels of power, different thoughts about the history of colonialism if you're in any African and other contexts of that kind. So yes, I think
that's why I was glad you mentioned colonialism, because that's one thing that is always on my mind, and one of the defining factors of that, you know, Western thought post-Enlightenment is that construction of boundaries. And even before there was the relativism, the classification was essential, and so that sort of boundaries kind of come in. And something that came up in Speakeasy a couple times ago was this idea of boundaries being fixed and permeable. But what if we thought about them as more dynamic and shifting and in flux? And that since systems thinking developed in the more Western mindset, I perceive that kind of those boundaries and constructs, partly what makes things complicated, perhaps not complex, but can get in the way. And so I'm just offering that up, like the boundaries that are imposed upon these, you know, when they're organized, like in what way, or what's informing that organization. And it's that kind of distinctifying. So
yeah, that's I mean, that's so interesting that there are system thinking, well, critical system thinking is questioning the boundaries all the time that you're drawing.
But they're being drawn. So
but they've always drawn, but if you can ask questions about the values that are going into drawing them a certain way and the facts that are being taken into account in drawing them a certain way, then you can challenge them from other perspectives, particularly the perspectives of the disadvantaged or the marginalized. That challenge is always there in critical systems thinking. The other
I want
thing,
to go back to field notes from 30 years ago and revisit them from a different perspective. So thanks so much.
Yeah, but I mean, I'm sure, you know, intelligent people working on the ground, yourself, do that all the time. What critical systems thinking does, it gives you a process of for doing that. If you're not, you know, if you're learning the ropes or if you're not so good at it, and a process of asking about who's benefiting, who are the decision makers, what expertise is used, and so on. So you can actually understand the boundaries and why those boundaries are drawn in a particular way. And the other thing that you alert me to is the restrictions on ways of engaging with the world that science imposes. So, for example, if you're led through the scientific method to engage with the world, then you're all the time seeking to understand it with a view to predicting and controlling it. And that became the Western mindset, of course, following Galileo and Descartes, reductionism, mechanism and reductionism, and Newton, you know, seemed to demonstrate that this reductionism, this mechanism worked, because it was able to deal with organized simplicity, as we've already described. But that was always opposed by the romantic thinkers, you know, poets and philosophers, who said, okay, if you engage with the world in that way, you're missing out on all other ways of engaging with the world, the more poetic ways of engaging the world, seeing people in relationship to their environment, seeing people as agents of change, and you know, all those other things are missed out from your conception of what a human being is in relation to the world. And science reinforces that. Mechanism reductionism reinforces that. The point I try to make in the latest book is that systems thinking opens up some of these alternative ways of engaging with the world that have been pushed into the background by science and the traditional scientific method. And so it's more easy to ask questions about, for example, the relationship of humans to other species and to the natural world. It's easier to ask questions about, should we just have a quantitative mathematical science, or shouldn't science embrace human subjectivity? There's a lot of opposition from the German playwright and philosopher Goethe to Newton's science. He said that, you know, somebody commenting on Goethe said somebody who was colorblind could completely understand what it was like to see in terms of Newton's science, because it was all about spectrums and optics, and you could understand it. But you totally don't then appreciate what color and is like, what actual seeing is like. What is science? That it cuts out all this human experience. So as well as being unable to deal with complexity because natural science struggles when it gets to the biological level, and when it gets to human, when it gets to the social level, because of, in Bowling's terms, the image and our interpretations of the world, and the fact that we're not just objects reacting in terms of stimulus response. It also limits us in terms of our perception of what's important in the world, and other ways in which, as I keep saying, the human species can appreciate and engage with the world. And system thinking, I think, can operate in both those domains to enrich our worldviews.
Thanks so much.
I think there's something, I mean, Mike, it was a very clear exposition, and I think it brings out one clear thing for me, is the growth of systems thinking actually matches late 19th, early 20th century philosophy of science, which is the Kantian concept. There are things we can understand and things which are known to God. So the definition of science has been about prediction and control, would have been challenged from the mid-20th century onwards. And, you know, I mean, I'm going to have to leave early, for which I apologize, but I'm working here at the Pasteur Institute on new approaches to measure human attitudes in clinical trials, not on the basis that we can predict them, but we can understand generic patterns in the way that things work. So I think, you know, in physics at the moment, there's assemblage theory and constructor theory, which are both arguing that information has mass, and that changes science as well. So I think we need to be really careful here, because creating a dichotomy between a very old philosophy of science and things which can't be explained like that is potentially damaging to precisely the thing you're talking about, which is how do we change the world so it's a better place to live in. So, I mean, I completely agree, as you know, on systems dynamics. I completely agree on the determinism of Santa Fe, but we need to update our scientific models rather than create that dichotomy.
Yeah, I accept that. And I think I was trying to be clear that it was the traditional scientific method that I was talking about. And of course, it's the case that science itself has become more systemic in when you get into the realms of relativity theory and quantum theory, and that science has indeed changed. So I was talking about the history of systems thinking and the way it thought about itself at that particular time, and it was opposing itself to the traditional scientific method. And in the second half of the talk, I think it's going to be interesting to discuss how new conceptual conceptual models of science and how new scientific discoveries since that time are relevant to higher levels of complexity, if you don't mind me using Boulding's thing again, and where we would potentially where we would potentially disagree, Dave, as you know. I don't doubt that exploring the kind of thing you've just described is highly valuable. It's just that it's not my experience in organizations that I can best check. Well, I don't know. I mean, I value the work you're doing, but I still work at a different level, which is at the level of the way people perceive things and the way that they act in terms of the way they perceive the world and the way their intentions and I act at the level of methodologies and systems terms which try to manage those kinds of things and to bring greater clarity to different ways that people understand the world and so on. Whether you will ever gain through science, well, it's an argument. I hope you don't have to go too soon, but it's a discussion for the second part of the talk, I think.
Yeah, I've got to go in about half an hour, but just to make the point of this, and I think it's important, all right, because there's a lot of agreement and there's some disagreements. I think one of the points is that engagement with how people understand the world needs to understand the social context in which they're working. That's also the neo-colonial point. So, for example, a lot of modern complexity science, certainly the side we're in, is looking at narrative patterns and narrative understanding and stabilities within those narrative patterns as a way of having a conversation with decision makers about what is possible and what isn't. Constructor theory in physics is very pragmatic for decision makers because it identifies what can't be changed. And the whole concept of a constructor which transforms things but doesn't itself act in the transformation creates stabilities. So I think we need to be careful on this. There are different approaches, different sciences, different methods, and different traditions in play here. Yeah.
But you brought out a point where I can perhaps just illustrate the difference again. You say constructor theory is very relevant to decision makers because it can tell them things that can't change. So you're in my terms, you're still being a little bit scientistic, Dave, in the sense that you believe that, well, you don't hide from that. You believe that in a naturalistic approach, in other words, that the ideas developed in the natural science are important in the social domain. I'm not sure how important they are in the social domain. I would address social reality differently to that, and therefore I doubt whether I'm ever in a position to tell decision makers what can change and what can't change. I'd be very believing on the basis of any kind of science that I could do that.
And I agree that is a difference, all right? I think we're coming from the perspective that you can't change gravity and their equivalents in human systems. And that's new materialism, which is a different type of philosophy, and that comes from Deleuzian epistemology combined with complexity theory. So I think we are saying there are some limits. You can say that some things aren't possible. Doesn't mean that you can say everything could be predicted. And even if you couldn't change it, doesn't mean you can predict the consequence of encountering the boundary within that. But yeah, it is a difference, right? We are coming from a naturalistic tradition and we are coming from a materialistic tradition. But remember, in new materialism, narrative has material reality.
That's right. And if you can find things and learn about things that can't be changed, so that decision makers are wasting their time in your SGI mapping kind of approach in seeking to move the rocks, instead of working with the things that do shift, then I would be extremely grateful. And that's why I see great value in what you're trying to do. But to me, that will never overtake the domain in which I seek to work within the social realm, which is at the level of ideas and the way people perceive the world and their intentions and so on, taking into account the social context in which they're operating. Pity we're having this debate now. But anyway, are there any other questions, or shall I move on, Barbara? Or...
Well,
a very quick question, Professor. I'm a complete outsider to complexity and systems engineering, so but I am a crisis management guy. So these days, the cognitive complexity is something that both myself and my colleagues have developed extensively, and it seems these days people are employing the AI almost as a prosthetics or augmenting it to their work. So, in your perspective, in your experience, in your expertise, is AI in a way a beneficial, something that helps evolve, improve cognitive complexity, or is it somehow like the law of diminishing returns? Thank you.
Uh, I'm always reluctant to move outside the area that I know well. I've been studying systems thinking for 40, 50 years, so I'll talk to anybody about systems thinking and think that I can give them a good game. When it comes to AI, I'm an amateur, so I've no better idea than you, than anybody else. I'm at the level of having a conversation in the pub rather than I am demonstrating any sort of learned expertise. Somebody that gave a lecture at my university, Hull University, I'm lucky enough to have a lecture series there in my name. Dave Snowden gave a lecture a couple of years ago. The guy who gave it last year said that he saw AI as the worst outcome of the problem as it is at the moment, and he couldn't see how that might be the solution. How the worst outcome of the problem could be the solution. So, and you can see all the issues with AI if it's used as an attempt to I don't know, predict and control, because you're never sure what biases are built into it, as we all know, on the common sense level. You know, if you build in the current knowledge of who to appoint at interview, you tend to get the same discriminations coming out as you would if you had no AI. On the other hand, as a tool to enhance, for example, a doctor looking at a scan and judging whether a tumor is malignant or not, or the degree of malignancy and so on, then clearly it's a highly useful tool. In the UK at the moment, there are big discussions about how to transform the National Health Service for the better. The government is again in this budget going to pour huge amounts of money into the National Health Service. Governments have done it in the past, and it's not had the results, let's put it this way, that were expected. In other words, the money gets eaten up and no productivity gains are arrived at. The AI is seen as a big way forward, but it wasn't long ago that there was an attempt to introduce an IT system into the National Health Service, which would capture the records of every individual, so anybody could access it. It was a complete failure. It was one of the most expensive failures in IT history, and unless AI is used alongside and as a tool to enable restructuring in the health service, then I could see the attempt to use the AI going the same way. So AI as a tool that can help us do what we want to do better, exactly right, but not as something that can tell us what to do, will be my common sense view of it.
Thank you very much, sir.
Okay, there's a discussion in the chat going on about boundaries, but I have the feeling that we should move on to the second half of your talk, your sort of little lecture, and then we'll come back to the questions in the chat. Some of them may be answered by the second half.
Okay, Barbara, thank you for that. Okay, I left it by, well, I've got no sympathy with the general systems theory approach that you're going to find general systems laws which can inform biologists to do their work better, or social scientists to do their work better, or decision makers to make their life easier. There's been a discussion over recent times between the Society for General Systems Research, now called the International Society for Systems Sciences, and systems engineers. Systems engineers want a theory to go behind their practice of engineering systems, and they look to the International Society for Systems Sciences to provide that in terms of general systems laws. As far as I'm aware, it's got nowhere. And I like to say that looking for general systems laws, such as Santa Fe does as well, is like waiting for Godot. In other words, it's not going to happen. It's not going to come along. You're wasting your time. I say that with the hope that some of these great brains that are spending their time on that will transfer their efforts elsewhere. I don't like being horrible to people these days. I used to be horrible to people. I don't like to be horrible to people these days, but I'd like to point out that they probably are wasting their time. So we're back in Moran's terms to what are useful partial truths when you can't understand the whole system. And you need to reflect upon your failure to understand the whole system. As Churchman said, every worldview is terribly restricted. And what I did to try and develop critical systems thinking was to try and find some useful partial worldviews, because that's obviously the next question. If we can't understand the whole system, what are useful partial ways of understanding the system? And I found particularly useful the work of a philosopher called Stephen Pepper in the pragmatist tradition, who wrote a book called World Hypotheses, and he went through the history of metaphysics to try and discover which particular worldviews had proven useful to the human species in engaging with the natural world and in building the social world. And he came up with four: formism, organicism, contextualism, and one more. And I said, look, it's okay, but Pepper's not a social scientist. He doesn't take account of, Dave was describing as the social context in which people operate. So I also need to look at social science and see what useful ways of seeing the world they've come up with that stood the test of time. And so I looked particularly at the work on sociological paradigms and also at Gareth Morgan's work on metaphors. And then you start to bring in the kind of thing around societal issues. So I ended up with what I, borrowing Pepper's terms, would call adequate systemic perspectives for looking at complex systems. Each of them restrictive, so each of them tells you some things, but it hides others. And those are the mechanical perspective, where you look at the world in terms of a mechanical system, and you're largely concerned with whether what you're observing has a clear goal and whether it's achieving that goal efficiently. You're concerned with efficacy and efficiency. And that's a highly useful way of looking at the world. And we wouldn't have achieved what we have as a species without having mastered this kind of mechanical, rational way of thinking. But it's limited. So a second way of addressing the world is to look at it in terms of interrelationships. Now that is a typical systems view, or systems brings to the table. If you look at system thinking, of course, I named some founding fathers, but there's lots of indigenous systems perspectives as well. And all the time in indigenous systems perspectives, it's about relationships. People with place, people with other people, people with the situation in which they're embedded. So interrelationships has always been there as a core systems concept. So it looks not so much at the elements of the parts, but the interrelationships between the parts. So that's another worldview which is extremely useful, I think. And then there's the organismic worldview. How do the parts function to maintain a whole in existence? How are wholes able to maintain and survive and thrive in turbulent environments that are changing all the time? How can they manage to survive in those sort of contexts? What are the functions of the parts in relation to the whole? That's a sort of organismic perspective. So if the mechanical perspective is a sort of Newton type view, but given a systems orientation, the interrelationships perspective is a natural system view. The organismic view is a kind of Aristotelian, Hegelian type of perspective about the parts functioning to maintain the whole in existence in a turbulent situation. And then there's Pepper's contextualism, which is the act in its context and the way that that's interpreted. And I call this the purposeful systems perspective. And this is the perspective which takes account of human understandings, the worldviews that people have, the way that they understand the world, their intentions, the different perspectives that exist because people come from different places in social systems, different cultures, etc. How you can potentially gain some kind of agreement or accommodation between different worldviews, but also how you avoid groupthink, so that the different worldviews can become a source of creativity rather than be congealed into a kind of groupthink. And then there's something that's not in Pepper, because he wasn't a social scientist, and that's the societal environmental point of view. So bringing power into the equation, who benefits and who doesn't benefit from a potential systems design, and what is impacted by a potential systems design, which might be marginalized groups or groups that you're marginalizing by not taking their interests into account, or it might be the environment, other species, or the environment upon which we as a human species depend. So, having gone through that literature of philosophy and social science and organization theory, to me, it's a useful starting point to think of any complex situation in terms of mechanical interrelationships, organismic, purposeful, and societal environmental perspectives. Now, it so happens, and you might think I must be cheating, it so happens that within systems thinking, there are 5 types of methodology. I can categorize them, and my justification is there in the books. There are 5 types of methodology corresponding to the 5 adequate systemic perspectives. I don't think it's cheating, because if, as Pepper says, these 5 adequate world hypotheses or systemic perspectives have helped the human species over time to grapple with the natural world and to build social systems, then it's not surprising that people will have come up with applied methodologies which enable them to do that. If I can find a Pepper quote, he said, we get some idea of our world from these vehicles, in my terms, the 5 systemic perspectives. And without them, we should have to walk pretty much in the dark. So those perspectives reveal useful things to us, and the methodologies based upon those perspectives enable us to act in the world in a way which I think you can demonstrate in pragmatic terms are useful ways which benefit the human species. So let me describe briefly the types of methodology that correspond to those different perspectives and try and show why they're powerful. So with the mechanical perspective, I guess applied systems thinking What came to the fore there, through the mechanical perspective, was through the Bell Telephone Laboratory, systems engineering and Deming's work, which led to thinking about the Toyota production system, Taiichi Ohno, Lean, Six Sigma, etc. Things which we tend to criticize if we don't look at the broader situation or context in which they are operationalized, as we were talking about earlier. You need to take the broader context into account, but which are extremely powerful if balanced out with other systemic perspectives and other ways of doing things. So look at the impact of Deming's work, which, looking back, it said transformed Japanese industry, and which woke up US industry, because the Japanese began to gain the upper hand in terms of white goods and in terms of their Toyota motor cars, etc. And still dominates a lot of the practice and a lot of the thinking in business and in industry. A very powerful way of looking at the world, and a set of tools which can help you to, with efficacy, with goal seeking and with efficiency. Systems engineering, there's a very influential economist in the UK now called Mariana Mazzucato, who wrote a book called The Mission Economy. And that book was all about the Apollo program. That was the mission, to get a man on the moon. It was systems engineering, or systems management as they called it, which was the methodology they used primarily to get a man on the moon. So it was goal-centered, allowing a fair degree of autonomy to the different organizations involved by NASA in the program, combination of public and private initiatives. And that mode of thinking, Mazzucato says, can be transferred to other problems in society. In the UK, in the health service, for example, mental health or obesity can be transferred to poverty. And you've got the current Labour government talking about mission-driven government. I'm drawing upon the ideas of Mazzucato to think about what mission-driven government would be like to try and address the major problems of society. So this is very, very much contemporary forms of systems thinking, in my view, limited because the problems of getting a man on the moon are much less severe than dealing with poverty or climate change. And she's aware of that, but nevertheless, useful starting point. And of course, I think it was Martin Luther King said, you know, let's look at it a different way. What's the point of getting a person on the moon so that a white man can look back on Earth and look at all the urban problems and the ghettos and the poverty that exists there. So there are other ways, of course, you need to look at, balance that point of view with other systemic perspectives and other systemic approaches. The interrelationships systemic perspective has been turned into a methodology called system dynamics, the work of Forrester. And that became famous through the limits to growth model, which was done by Donella Meadows. So if there's a mother of systems thinking, it's Donella Meadows. And a world model which looked at key variables in the world system, pollution, industry, population, etc., and predicted about early 1970s that if we weren't careful, that the world was going to reach crisis, almost doomsday scenario, by 2/3 way through the 20th century. So though it was challenged considerably, and people said, for example, you didn't take into account the technological developments that enabled us to avoid this, and so they interpreted it as a predictive model, was actually a clarion call, and said, look, if we don't do something, if decision makers don't do something about these different variables, then you will inevitably end up with doomsday scenario. And unfortunately, we're still on track to that doomsday scenario, because decision makers have not taken the necessary decisions to deal with these issues. So if you take it as a system dynamics model that way, as alerting you to some potential issues if you don't do something about them, then it was a powerful model. And it's a methodology that's been used a lot in the UK. For example, a report on child protection, the Monroe report used system dynamics models to in a sense, reinforce what decision makers already knew, that too much prescription was preventing social workers doing their job properly. And they would depend upon the rules and the tick boxing rather than their expertise in dealing with children in risk. It's being used currently by the UK government in their drive towards net zero, because obviously achieving net zero in the UK, in any country, requires you to work across departments in the civil service in the UK. And so you need a model which enables all the different departments that might impact net zero to see what they're doing might impact carbon emissions and might jeopardize what you're trying to achieve in terms of net zero. So one model, a system dynamics model, it's not trying to predict the future, but it is trying to alert people to and to combine people's perspectives and get them think about what they're doing might have an impact upon the whole. Organismic modeling, there are some powerful models in systems thinking which take the organismic view. Socio-technical thinking was based upon organismic thinking. So was the most powerful that I think still highly useful was a model invented by a cybernetician called Stafford Beer, called the viable system model, which you may have heard of in terms of complexity. Derived from the human body and the nervous system. The latest book on it by Martin Fiffner is called The Neurology of Business. Still, very much a biological organismic model, concerned with how a system should function in order that it can survive and thrive. 5 essential subsystems or functions must be there, according to Beer, and they must be organized in a certain way so that the system can remain viable and thrive in a turbulent environment. Socio-technical organismic modeling was responsible for a major initiative in Norway in the 70s to democratize the country. Stafford Beer famously used the viable system model in support of Allende's government in Chile when they were nationalizing the economy to try and reorganize the nationalized economy. It's a model that you can use quickly and powerfully to bring an organismic view to an organization. I've been using it with an organization called Hull Children's University, Hull and East Yorkshire Children's University, when they restructured to take into account a wider geographical area. It scales. A project I was involved in Uganda was looking at how United Nations initiatives in Uganda, why they were not having the impact upon development that was hoped. And using the viable system model, you could see there was no agreed purpose. There was no congruence between what the government said it wanted to achieve in terms of development and what the UN agencies wanted to achieve. There were about 29 UN agencies operating in Uganda, and they weren't coordinated in any way. So looking through the lens of that model, you could build a model of aid or development in Uganda, if you like, which took into account the things which were missing, the functional things that needed attention to, if it was going to be a viable system and if it was going to be able to manage itself effectively and continue to exist in the light of the kind of emergencies which are constantly impacting that kind of country. The purposeful perspective here, we're at the level of humans. The breaks here in systems thinking were with Churchman. It may seem a trite comment, but he said the systems approach begins when first you see the world through the eyes of another. So very much putting it you know, like falling in love when we first see the rise to the world of another. Almost, you know, trying to show what a big break that was from trying to understand and manipulate the system. You have to look at all these alternative worldviews and understand them in some ways. And Checkland in the UK took forward the work of Churchman and Akoff in the States, and developed soft systems thinking, which is a method of, if you like, articulating different perspectives that have come to bear in a problem situation, a complex problem situation, articulating them in conceptual models, not trying to capture the world or any reality, but people's perspectives of the world, to allow them to have a much richer debate about the different perspectives and come probably not to an agreement, but to an accommodation. So yes, we can all agree that this is somehow useful and worth doing now in the current situation, and we'll go away and we'll continue to have our differences, but these things at least are worth doing now and look as though they will bring improvement. And as I say, constantly challenging any congealed perspective that comes to dominate an organization, any kind of groupthink. And Churchman would do that through what he called dialectical debate. He went through the philosophies and Hegel's dialectical debate, translated in strategic assumption surfacing and testing, translated these days into red team thinking, which the UK government has acknowledged was missing in the early days of COVID and would have greatly benefited if they had alternative ways beyond SAGE, the government advisory body, challenging the groupthink that existed at that time. So here you're intervening at the level of people's perspectives and the way that they view complex systems, rather than trying to intervene at the level of the system, if you like. This is much more cognitive complexity in Russia's sense. And finally, the societal environmental perspective, where if you do a systems design, you must always take into account of where you're drawing the boundaries, because you'll always be drawing boundaries because you can't understand the whole system. And are you, in drawing the boundaries in a particular place, ignoring some of the stakeholders who have a right to have their views and their interests taken into account? And they're not being taken into account because they're potentially marginalized or potentially disadvantaged by the social system, or turning it again to the environmental issues, you're ignoring other species, or you're ignoring the damage we're doing to the environment on which we depend. So corresponding to each of the ways of looking at the world, there are systems perspectives which allow you to act in the world according to each of those perspectives. Okay, so if you're looking at the complex problem situation through the different perspectives, and it looks as though the issues you're facing are issues of resilience, agility, ability to adapt in the situation, everything's changing, but your organization's still based upon hierarchy and silos, and so you can't adapt, you can turn to a particular systems methodology that will help you in that context. Having done that, you may have brought about structural change, but not taken account of the cultural change that potentially needs to go with it. And you can move towards a purposeful perspective to recognize that, and the kinds of systems methodology that would enable you to do that. While you're doing that, you may be neglecting efficiency and efficacy. You may lose sight of the achievement of goals and how efficiently you do that. You may lose sight of the fact that you're damaging the environment, somehow marginalizing the environment in your thinking. So critical systems thinking tries all the time to have you operating from these different perspectives, so you don't get carried away by any one of them. You've got a much more balanced view of the way that things might be changing and the way that things might be operating and how you want to improve the system. And it gives you the appropriate methodologies to work with it. So I'll come to a conclusion of this bit. if you work with critical systems thinking, it's multi-perspectival. I'm not saying that these are the only perspectives you can take, of course they're not, but they're powerful perspectives which I would argue you need to take into account in any situation. Look at the world through these different lenses, and they'll tell you different things to which you need to pay attention. And that's the best we can do. They're partial perspectives, but they're powerful perspectives which have proven themselves useful. We can also, it's multi-methodological, is critical systems thinking, because we have at our disposal this powerful set of proven systems methodologies which can do good work. They've been well researched, they've been shown to be effective in practice. There's a literature associated with them all. You can recover what's happened when they've been used and why they've worked. And that's good. And so it's multi-methodological. You need to find a way, and this is an ideal type, because of any situation, I'm trying to present what systems thinking has achieved over 40 years or more. This is what systems thinking can offer you. You might not think it's very much. You might think it's a lot. I think it's quite a lot. But this is what systems thinking you can offer you. To use all this stuff at once is an ideal type. You won't be able to do that. In any situation, you'll be constrained by resources, by politics, and all the rest of it. But at least you'll know how you're being constrained and how you're being constrained, and what it is that you're not being able to bring to the table and to the party. So ideally, you'll operate with these perspectives and these methodologies at once, but you're never able to do that. But it's an ideal that allows you to reflect upon whether you're falling short. And in judging whether you're brought about improvement, you need similarly to be multidimensional. Have we brought about improvement in terms of efficiency, in terms of resilience and adaptability, in terms of everybody being involved and sharing perspectives and coming to greater mutual understanding, in terms of taking into account the unintended consequences that might have arisen through the interactions, in terms of taking into account whether you brought greater benefit to marginalized groups and to the environment. And that's basically critical systems thinking. And I've set out this in the book, latest book, this EPIC methodology for being multidimensional, multi-perspectival, intervening flexibly and evaluating multidimensionally as well. And EPIC is very much used with tongue-in-cheek because it indicates that this is an ideal type which you'll have to adjust in any engagement with a complex system. It's a learning process. Which of these worldviews and which of these methodologies will bring greatest benefit. So this, as I see, is an alternative to the traditional scientific method. And we can argue the extent to which complexity theory is bringing new science to the table, which will show the limits on which this work is possible. And I hope it does, because that will make the job easier. We can move some things out and engage others in. But dealing in this kind of way with complexity, I think, is always going to be essential at the level of human beings and human person, as a complement to traditional science or complexity, or the science that complexity theory can have. And let's not forget that complexity theory itself is massively divided. It'll provide you with a more balanced view of the world. The mechanistic thinking that came to dominate the Western tradition after the scientific revolution. You can balance with organismic thinking, the purposeful perspectives, the societal environmental perspective, the organismic perspective. It cannot replace decision makers and their experience and their knowledge of context, but it can enable them to think in different ways, alternative ways, and to bring different tools and methodologies to the table in trying to improve the complex situations in which they find themselves. So forget the idea of systems thinking as a set of general systems laws that will give you expertise about everything. This is what systems thinking can do for you. And I think that it's quite a lot. It's enough. And it's worth having on the table and understanding. Thanks, Barbara.
Oh, thank you, Mike. That was wonderful. It really, it gave a whole sort of context and perspective on systems thinking that I think has been lacking in recent discourse. So we really appreciate that and we thank you.
Thank you.
Jocko already has his hand up. I would encourage everyone with questions to put their hand up if they can, so that I can try to, we do need to be respectful of Mike's time. So I want to keep this flowing as much as possible. So Jocko, take it away.
Yeah, thanks. That was a lot and it was awesome. And I reiterate everything Barbara just said, but that sort of goes to the point of my question. One of the critiques I've heard of systems thinking is, and quite frankly, to any fill in the blank thinking, is the ever expanding boundary conditions of what you're including in the system, right? So if we are encountering a problem, that we'll include it into part of our system boundaries, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Any kind of way that you can address that or help us to address that, or what's your thinking in terms of establishing the system boundaries, even though we know that those system boundaries are mostly just what we're interested in, but to guard against this ever expansion on these system boundaries? Your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, you're right, Jocko, that traditional systems thinking, people, it was saying that everything is interconnected. And that means, of course, that you can never understand everything. And you can never know whether, when you're acting, you're not going to set off a chain of events that actually makes things worse. That's why systems thinking has, if you like, rethought itself. And now it has a way of, it doesn't just bring bad news, it has a way of bringing some good news, which is that there are some useful partial perspectives which we can employ with reasonable confidence because they've proven useful, and we have methodologies which have proved useful that are based on those perspectives. The other thing I'd say is that what system thinking now asks you to do is always be aware of exactly the point you've made, that in seeking to improve a system, you'll be drawing the boundaries somewhere. And you need always to reflect upon where you're drawing the boundaries. Now, thanks to the work of Churchman and a guy called Werner Ulrich with his critical systems heuristics, and my colleague at Hull, Joel Midgley, there's been a lot of work on boundary judgments and how to interrogate boundary judgments. And this essentially means asking, well, who's involved as a decision maker in deciding to make this change to the system or to design the system this way? Who's involved in terms of expertise? So you can easily have people ruled out because they're perceived not to have expertise, but they might have expertise. So it's worth asking the question, who's involved as an expert? Who are you taking into account as the client of the system? You know, who are you trying to do this for? And what's your legitimation for this design? And that's asking the question, whose interests you're not taking into account. They may not be there at the table discussing the system's design, but they will be affected by it. And therefore you have an obligation, according to this thinking, to take into account their interests, to somehow have them represented. Either bring them to the table or have somebody else speak for them. You can imagine somebody speaking for the environment or somebody speaking for future generations. So using this kind of checklist of boundary critique, you can get some understanding of where you're drawing the boundaries, what values and facts you're taking into account in drawing the boundaries in a particular way. And then you can say, well, what if I introduce a different client who I hadn't considered before? What if I introduce a different form of expertise, for example? Does that lead me to draw the boundary in a different place so that I take into account maybe things that I previously neglected? And you can set up that discussion then about the different ways of drawing the boundaries in different ways, and who's involved, who's not involved, etc., etc. So within systems thinking, there are ways of questioning boundaries. I think the 5 perspectives that I've talked about tend to draw the boundaries in different ways as well. So using those 5 perspectives, you'll inevitably be taken to different places in terms of boundary judgments. So, for example, if you're just considering how to make a system more efficient, then you probably won't be considering its impact upon the environment or its impact upon other marginalized groups. But you bring that into the equation through the societal environmental perspective. So you can see how this operates in this kind of way of thinking that I'm trying to introduce, of different perspectives challenging one another all the time, and different methodologies being available to you to privilege those different perspectives. I can't hear you, Jocko.
Okay.
Thank
Jocko?
you. No, I'll jump to Greg in real quick. I'll jump it over to Craig. But the problem, the challenge there is your nested systems, right? So each one of those groups that you're considering in and of itself is a boundary condition that it can expand. And I think that's oftentimes how these system boundaries expand, is by the subsystems expanding inside of them. So that's an interesting thing, but I don't want to get stuck on this point. So I'm going to throw it over to Greg. Greg, you have a question?
Okay, so it's going to be Greg and then Wendy and then Yulia, and then we'll see where we stand with the time. So Greg,
Yep.
take it away.
Thanks, Mike, for that. I was reminded of Stacey's, having a better model basically is not going to allow us to basically understand and control the world. But what I wanted to come back to is a play on the boundary question, Jacko's boundary question. This is really about the fact that you talked about emergence, but you didn't talk about co-evolution of the system, the agents in the system co-evolving. And again, this comes from effectively from a Stacey perspective, where there's a temporality. If the system in a short time frame, basically we can actually have control, but in a longer time frame we can't, because the agents in the system will co-evolve, because fundamentally most systems are open in nature. So, we'll put the boundary issue to the side, Jacko, but I'd be interested, Mike, in your comments around co-evolution.
Yeah, I think what you're describing, Greg, is a way of understanding complex systems, if you like, as co-evolving with the environments, which is present, I guess, in Stacey's later stuff. Well, maybe in the early stuff as well. But also present in Maturana and Varela and all those kinds of people and they come from a biological thing. So it's very much present in Stafford Beer's work and in the viable system model. So I accept that that's a reasonable way of that's a reasonable perspective to bring in trying to understand the nature of the system. What I'm trying to get us away from is the belief that using these kinds of metaphors and analogies, which is, I think, what complexity theory can bring to the table quite well, is going to get us ever to a position where we can explain and predict and control the way a system behaves. So for me, it's all about, I'm interested in intervening in a system in a guided way, having examined the nature of the complexity I'm confronted with through these different perspectives, intervening in the system in a way which will allow me to learn whether that way of working is going to bring, in pragmatist sense, benefit, is going to pay off. But all the time aware that because of the complexity, it might come back to bite me. But I don't want to be lost in that situation, because I want to all the time as well step back and say, okay, well, I've done so and so, and I seem to have improved things in terms of we're now more efficient than this other organization to which I'm comparing myself. But I need to also take these other few points into account to get a more balanced, rounded picture of what it is that I'm actually achieving. So for me, Yeah, good luck to those who want. I think complexity theory has benefited us in, bringing some concepts to the table, which are insightful and decision makers can use in their work to try and understand what's going on. Edge of chaos is a useful one. Strange attractors is a useful one. But I don't want ever to, as Santa Fe does, get to the stage where I believe this is going to allow me to build some kind of models, because though agents co-involve with the environments, we can never, in my view, we can never model the complexity of agents sufficiently enough to enable us to understand the way in which they'll co-evolve with their environments. So I want to set up a whole learning process using a variety of different perspectives and a variety of different methodologies. And my justification is the pragmatist one, that these seem to have proven useful, and I can give you evidence that these methodologies have worked in the ways that they're intended to work.
No, that's great. Thank you.
Okay, Wendy.
Right. I'm interested in the evolution of change over time, and I became attracted to, and I haven't seen more current writing on it, but Stuart Brand's pacing layers. And you've got 5 levels of methodology matching 5 levels of groupings of, ways of taking on complexity. So these pace layers, it seems to me, if you don't, as Stuart Brand's talking about, if you don't have methodologies that address the different levels of stuckness, if you like, in the system, at the same time, something that happens at a fast pace, like, the fashion, which is the sort of inner layer, is never going to catch up with some of the structural changes. You can't drive the system that way. You need interventions at multiple levels of time to all be working in sync together, so the cogs start to turn the whole system or meta system. So could you talk about pace layers and how they fit in there?
I don't know that work, Wendy, but it sounds incredibly interesting in terms of linkages with what I've been describing. Whether you can gain sufficient, I don't know. I can't say much, but it sounds a bit scientistic again, as though you can somehow know what's happening at all these different layers. And no.
So the example I'll give is shearing. I did a legal case. The structure of the shearing shed really affects how people can interact within it. And pace layers was a really good way of saying how you can't actually change the whole system of shearing unless you deal with the fact that the shape of the shed actually affects the social interaction. And there's a whole stack of reasons why that shed came into a particular shape. And the nature of sheep and the nature of people and the nature of, the properties of scientific systems that allow you to sheep shear differently. If you try and change things in a higgledy-piggledy way, you actually end up with wasted effort or being too early or too late. So time is a factor in change.
Yeah, so I can see similarities in terms of I'm pointing to different perspectives, which will draw your attention to different aspects of the systems, hiding things and showing you others. But I'm afraid I'm still going to say I need to read the work, so I won't comment. But it does sound to me scientific, in the sense that you somehow can come to some kind of understanding of how you did to change these things so that they all are in synergy, if you like.
Well, at least dealing with the adjacent things. So, fashion and some of the more structural things, which is what one of our earlier speakers was concerned about, that, you've got something that's more fluid, and then the structural thing holds the fluid thing back when the fluid thing's made some progress, and therefore you get stuckness at that level.
Yeah, I'd absolutely agree with that.
Yeah, so it's a version of that, and the stuckness appears at different levels, and the readiness and the stuckness need to be all shifting vaguely at the same time to get the whole flow to change through.
Lots of examples of that. Thank you for that. The structure of an organization, or a traditional hierarchical organization, for example, would not allow people to have the conversations that would be necessary to adapt quickly and creatively in a turbulent environment. So that would all be, in my terms, about getting the structures of the organization right, so that the correct conversation, the reasonable conversations could take place, which would enable cultural change to take place, because the right people were talking to the right people, and you decentralize potentially from the silo kind of organization. That's exactly what Stafford Beer's model claims to do, to allow the right conversations to take place in an organization, so that the organization can adapt and remain viable and flourish in the environment in which it finds itself.
Yeah, Conway's law fits in there too, that the product resembles the system of communication that was used to design it.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
that's a bit of fun. I'll leave the conversation to the
I'll
next.
look up that work. Thanks for drawing attention to it.
Thanks, Wendy. Julia.
Hi, thanks a lot. I'm in deep gratitude for this privilege even to be here and to be able to talk to all of you. I have a traditional question, and Barbara knows it already. My question is, how can we try and democratize this knowledge on systems thinking and complexity management so that it is accessible to business schools, so that we in business schools could teach future managers to understand the complexity rather than doing endless SWOT analysis and 5 driving forces. And I know that Dave Snowin is also criticizing this approach a lot. My question is, can this trend on sustainability and sustainable goals be an entrance point to introduce the levels of complexity we're dealing with, so that we could give a couple of ways to look at it? How are you teaching, or how are you, where do you think could be this point of connection as low, like not talking about PhD students, master or MBAs, but even at bachelor level of management, so that we could give could somehow give the tools to the students and actually to the teachers?
Thank you so much for that question, because it goes to my heart, because for this reason, the demand for systems thinking has never been greater there in the outside world. If you look at what the UN Development Programme talks about, if you look at what the OECD talk about, the World Health Organization talk about, all these international bodies, if you look what a lot of business people talk about, Paul Polman talks about different ways of understanding. If you look at the way government is thinking, Patrick Vallance, the Minister for Science in the UK, is a systems thinker, and he says it's absolutely essential in policy. And the systems thinking interest group in the UK civil service now is up to about 800 people. I co-chair a systems thinking working group with the Government Office for Science in the UK. The interest externally in systems thinking is massive. The demand is massive. The supply by universities is pathetic. You know, they are terrible. They are terrible. And so why is that the case with universities, and how can we change it? The reason, I think, is that universities are there to give their staff a good life, rather than to actually be interested in the problems that the world faces. They're very disciplinary. I probably don't need to tell you this, because I think most people would say the same. They're very disciplinary, and people gain their promotions and their grants through staying within their discipline, and they gain their reputations for doing that. So getting people to work across faculties is very, very hard. They're developing their careers because of their expertise in one discipline. They don't particularly like getting out of the ivory tower and going outside and working with people who are actually trying to deal with issues. So how do you do something about it? And the situation is not improving. You know, I could tell you that, I mean, the UK, I think, is better than most, but systems departments in UK is struggling, because, you know, once you get universities that have got financial problems, for example, then the first ones you cut are those where undergraduate students don't naturally go to, because it takes a bit of experience before you understand the value of system thinking. I think that, as you suggested, the kinds of problems that we're beginning to face, that we are facing in the world around climate change and in government, about how to deal with an aging population, how to deal with inequality, all these problems are multi-perspectival, multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary. And so it's going to ultimately, decision makers, maybe government, is going to have to act, and is going to have to say to universities, look, we'd like you to become a little bit more relevant in what it is you're doing. Okay, we can have the Oxford and Cambridges of this world, pursuing their agendas, and I'm all keen on all that stuff being done, the basic research, but we also have to have universities that are more engaged with the practical problems that the world faces. And I honestly think that has to come from governments. And that's what I'm trying to do in the UK, to press the government to recognise that there are transdisciplines such as systems thinking and complexity theory, which have got something to say about these issues, which they have tended to believe nobody has anything to say about. It's left just to common sense and experience. We can help to enhance that common sense and experience, and to put some resource behind systems thinking and complexity theory. I can't, but the crises of all types that we face will hopefully have that outcome. But it's a difficult one because, last point in response to this question, you can tell it's dear to my heart, is that there's an apprenticeship in the UK, a systems thinking apprenticeship set up in the UK. It's been very hard to find the staff to teach it, because there are not well-established systems programs turning out people. There are systems engineering programs, system dynamics. There aren't systems programs giving you this variety of systems approaches that I've tried to explain, so that you get individuals rounded and capable of seeing the world in different ways and using the variety of systems methodologies being developed. And that's where we need somehow to get to. And, MBAs don't do anything. They still divide the world up into, aspects of management. Problems are not marketing problems or production problems or R&D problems. They're transdisciplinary problems and impact that have, elements of all these things involved in them.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your answer.
Thanks for your question.
Well, I actually think that's a fine place to stop. We're almost the hour. So, Dr. Jackson, would you like to tell our audience where they can find your work and a little bit about your new book?
Thank you. Thank you, Barbara. Well, as I say, I've been going at it for quite a long time, systems thinking. This was my grand opus, if you like, critical systems thinking and the management of complexity. But it is quite long. About 700 pages of the whole history of systems thinking and the different strands in systems thinking. Just this year, I've written a practitioner's guide to systems thinking, which, in a sense, is what I've explained today. So for an audience that doesn't necessarily want to go into the whole of philosophy and the history, but does enough, I think, in terms of those things, explains why the background of systems thinking, explains, I think, complexity theory, the different strands of complexity theory, and which tries to show how best to use these ideas, what I found useful over 40 odd years of engaging with the ideas and trying to use them in practice. And I've always only been interested in using them in practice. So when I get theoretical, I'm still asking myself, what difference does this make in practice? So this critical systems thinking, a practitioner's guide, is my attempt to say, this is what the systems tradition has to offer. You take it and see what you find useful within that tradition. And of course, anybody who's been on this call, let me again thank the Complexity Lounge for giving me the opportunity to present these ideas, who has a look at the book. I'd be delighted to hear what they think about it and what they have to say about it and how they think the ideas can be taken forward. Thank you.
Thank you. The first book was awesome. The second one is in my queue, so I highly recommend. Okay, Mike, we can't thank you enough for being here. This was truly great. I mean, please come back anytime. I think there's a lot left to explore on this topic. I feel like we're really getting into it.
Yeah.
And thank you to all of you. You made this a really rich and engaging experience, and we always appreciate it that you're along for this ride with us. Our next meetup is a triumph of my scheduling abilities once again. It will be next week on Tuesday, November 5th. Yes, election day in the US. It will take your mind off of everything. When we will be joined by Dr. Ron Westrum, creator of the Westrum's organizational typologies, to talk about his work on hidden events. Thanks again, Mike, and we'll see you all very soon. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.